Hi, this is Erica Mello, and welcome to episode number 152 of Tough to Treat. And this episode is about how to troubleshoot through a plateau, because we've all been there and it can be very frustrating. So, in this episode, I give you some bullet points on what to do when that happens to you and how to take a step back and look at your patient through more of an objective lens. And I also present a very brief case example of a patient of mine where I had to do this. So on to the episode. Enjoy. Hi, everybody. This is Erica Mello, and welcome to episode number 152 of Tough to Treat. And Susan and I, throughout all of the episodes we've done over the years, we always talk about patients who, perhaps have plateaued and then they pushed through it, or some patients, just reach a point and, you need to figure out what do they need now, right? How can we take them to where they want to be, not necessarily where we want them to be, right? And I think throughout all of our episodes, we really put the patient, of course, at the center of what we call a clinical puzzle. So this episode is about how to troubleshoot a plateau, and it happens to everybody. And so I'm going to give you just some bullet points to note down, when you have a patient who fits this scenario, and we all have them, as I said. So I recently did a masterclass and I talked at length about this, and this will be a little bit of an abbreviated version of that masterclass. So the first thing you want to do is, number one, don't blame your patient and don't blame yourself, right? Easier said than done, right? So you really want to think about, let's look at this objectively. So you want to go back to their story, go back to their narrative, okay? Look at their timeline, their injury timeline. And I'll give you an example of a patient of mine to illustrate some of these points. So you go back to their story, go back to their timeline. Let's say, for example, they had low back pain and their driver was their hip, for example, and you're progressing, moving them along, working, obviously working and focusing on their driver, the hip, and then they plateau. You go back and they have a shoulder injury in their history. They have a knee injury in their history. They have a foot injury in their history. Those are potential secondary issues that could come up as your patient moves through the exercise program or moves through the treatment program. Whether you're going, this does tend to happen when you increase load or when you increase like range of motion, and mostly load. So go back to their story and see if there's another region of the body that perhaps you missed, or not missed, it didn't appear at the beginning, but as your patient becomes, we call more robust, as they have more movement options. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we want our patients to move and feel better. So as you're progressing them, they're going to have more movement options, and secondary issues will come up. They are extremely common. So go back to their story and see if there's a region of the body that could potentially, it's a prior injury, that could potentially be coming up for them, okay? That will be number one. Excuse me. The other issue is you want to think about if your patient is, whether they're a weekend warrior, so to speak, or if they're very active, or if they're an athlete, collegiate, professional. You want to think about the sport that they play and what do we know about those sports. So I'll give you just a quick example with tennis players, and I'll show you with I'll talk about my patient in a second. Tennis players, we know there's a lot of compression in their upper thorax and their GH, their glenohumeral joint. We know that. So if your patient has some issues that let's say, although we'll consider low back pain again, or elbow pain, right? Go and you look through their injury history and you're really not finding anything that could potentially be a secondary issue. Go to their movement history. If they play tennis for a long period of time, you could be missing something up in their upper thorax, up in their GH, even in their neck, right? Less likely in their neck, but mostly GH, upper thorax, and certainly elbow, right? So you want to think about that may be another region of the body based on their movement history. Also, tennis is a sport of weight shift, just like golf, weight shift. If they have a foot injury in their history, even if they don't, let's say they don't, and they're not weight shifting properly, it could be that that's something that you need to focus on in their program. So that brings me to my second bullet point. You want to reassess another movement. Okay, so your patient plateaus. Let's say you looked at a squat in your initial evaluation, unloaded, easy to assess, right? When they're moving along and they hit a plateau, reassess something else. Maybe it doesn't. It could be, let's say if they're a runner, for example, you can assess a lunge, forward, backwards lunge. Let's say use a tennis player as an example. Most people would have assessed a bilateral arm lift or a single arm lift at the beginning, but why don't you check to see if this person can weight shift? Have them do a lateral lunge and see if they can come back and find their center. Have them go to lateral lunge to the left, see if they can find their center. Have them go to the right, see if they can find their center. Have them do a split squat. Just change something up to see if something else is jumping out at you or another region is jumping out at you. The third bullet point would be increase load. That's obvious, right? Either add weight, have them maybe do a plyometric if that's safe for your patient, have them do increase TheraBand, increase the load. It could be anything. Or you can change their center of mass, which is what I do often. I reassess this, as you know. You have them stand normal, narrow, wide. And for those of you who listened to the episodes prior, you'll know that if someone generally looks or feels off when they're narrow, there's a high likelihood that there is something in their lower extremity that you need to investigate. Have them go on the wall, normal, narrow, wide, see what they look like. See if there's something you've missed in their upper extremity. Same process, normal, narrow, wide, hands on the wall, narrow. Maybe there's something in their neck, GH, thorax, shoulder, scapula that you missed, right? Or that's just coming up now. So that's, changing the center of mass. And that's also reassessing another movement, right? You just need to change something. And what I want you to also think about when you're problem solving a plateau, you want to think about what is the impairment. And I mean by impairment is it an overactive system I'm still dealing with? Or is it an underactive system where movement and endurance or strength protocols are warranted? Sometimes when we go to higher load or we're almost at the end of our program and they just need to get that 20% more, right? You need to use some advanced clinical reasoning. And I think that going back to the basics, going back to the beginning, like going back to their story, more often than not at the beginning, a lot of systems are very overactive. We've got your back grippers, your butt grippers, your chest grippers. A lot of people have these gripping strategies that we need to get them out of, right? So if that's still the case, or if that's the case now again, then you need to put them in positions that will take out their dominant movement pattern. And I believe Susan and I talked about this, not on the last episode. I believe it was probably 148 and 149, where we talked about down training movement patterns. Maybe that's where you need to go at this point, right? You need to put them in positions that are going to take this pattern out. Because a lot of times the systems will become a little bit more overactive as they start to do more challenging movements. Or do they just need to train? And a lot of people just do at this point. And so then you're going to go back to your story, reassessing your movements. I'll summarize this in a second. But you also want to think about, is there a hole in your exercise program? Can be definitely, an issue. I think that, some people start off very easy and then they go into really high load quickly. We're sort of missing those middle phases of exercise. And I think that you want to think about, okay, maybe I need to sort of give them something a little bit easier to do and work my way up. Okay, so that's like the obvious answer. They could be just the exercise you're giving them is just too hard, right? And so you want to think about, I'll redo these bullet points here, go back to their story, reassess another movement pattern, increase the load, change their center of mass. You want to think about what their impairment is and what do they need now? Like right now, do we need to go back to releasing a couple of muscles that are starting to become overactive again? And if you do that, you would definitely have to do it in positions where the person is exhibiting that overactivity. Going back on the table, supine, prone, probably won't cut it at that point, right? You can do some active release with movement. What do they need now? Okay, so just to illustrate this point, I'm going to give you an example, a quick example of a patient of mine. So this particular patient is, or was, I treated him a while ago, a tennis player and fairly active, definitely played a lot competitively throughout college and throughout preschool and not preschool, excuse me, high school. Plays a lot now, but has a day job, right? So, but the movement patterns are going to be there. Okay, so he had issues with some right arm pain, and his driver was his upper thorax. Okay, it was not his shoulder. It was not coming from his neck like a radiculopathy. So he was moving along, doing well. Okay, so you want to think about, okay, is there a secondary issue? In this case, there was. So it'll come, as I mentioned earlier, from their story. You want to broaden your lens, okay? And what do they need now, okay? His injury history came with his mate is on his right side, and his center of mass was initially very left. He had a right knee injury in his history, and he offloaded that for years, and it became his new normal, right? So every time he hit the ball, he pretty much hit it from his left leg, and that got better. So he started to get himself more centered. He improved. But then we were like, we wanted him to be able to play for long periods, like weeks, with like no break. And that's kind of hard when you're not a professional player, right? But this was a goal of his. And so ultimately I went back and I actually changed the movement. So in the beginning of this episode, I talked about, changing a movement or assessing a different movement. And so I did two things. I had him do like a side lunge. So I need him to find his center. Ultimately he needs to be able to go to his right, and clearly he goes to his left because he's very much weight bearing on his left side. So I had him just go into a little bit of a mini squat, not too much to exacerbate the knee. And then I had him lunge to the left and I had him stay there. I said, now I want you to go back and find your center. I don't want you to go all the way to the right. I want you to go back to find your center. And I did the same thing. So when he went from his left, when he did a lateral lunge left and he went back to his right, his strategy, he completely shifted his thorax. He could not get really centered. And he was like, oh, I have a hard time with this. And so I had him go to the right. And then I had him, same thing, go back to left. That was much easier. So clearly he had a hard time finding his center. And so that is something that I would urge you to look at in case this is what your patient needs. So clearly training his center of mass is something that I needed to focus on much more in the exercise program. But because of his secondary issue in his knee, I needed to treat that at this point. If you have some issues in your lower extremity from a prior injury, they will come up later if you're trying to progress your patient through upright activities. This guy's a tennis player, he needs to be upright. So those secondary issues are the ones that will limit you, and those could potentially plateau your patient. So with this particular patient, we were moving along great. His driver was in his upper thorax, doing well. He was playing. but he wasn't able to play like 3 days in a row. And so I went back, I looked at the story, I trained a new movement. As I said, I just had him do a lateral lunge, and I also had him do just split squats just to see what was coming out. And I realized that he could not get on his right leg, and it wasn't coming from his shoulder or his thorax or his neck or any part of his upper extremity. It actually was coming from his knee, and I needed to get him over onto that right side. And so we started working on the knee, and his progress started to become much more rapid. So I wanted to talk about this because, as I said, I did a masterclass actually a couple of weeks ago, if you're listening to this live. And I talked a lot about plateaus because I get a lot of questions asked about that. And as I said earlier, it does happen to everybody, right? And so you don't want to get yourself frustrated. You really want to think about, okay, how can I look at this from an objective point of view? So I hope this helps. And Susan and I still want to direct your sites to our website. It's toughtotreat.com. And we're at now, this will be 152 episodes, and we've covered the gamut of topics. So if you've listened to every episode, fantastic. Most of you probably have not. And if you have an issue that, a part of the region of the body or a subject that you want more information on, go on to the website. There's a searchable function by keyword, and you'll see all the episodes that we've devoted to that particular topic. And as I said, we have definitely run the gamut. So thank you again, and we'll see you on the next episode.